what's going to happen today is I want to answer a query of Alan last time. Uh, it's a it's a big question. I'm going to try to do the best I can to answer it quickly because really it'll take the rest of the semester and then some to answer it. But what he asked was he always thought that Platonism was about there being perfect images or perfect models or forms of everything in the world of forms. And the example he gave was a perfect oak leaf. And I just wanted to, just so we get out of that one, this is not a good representation of what the theory of forms is. The theory of forms is about things that are universal and eternal models, but they're also objective and things that can only be perceived by the mind. That's the kind of thing that's in the world of forms. So you wouldn't have a perfect oak leaf. Um, Here's some other things that wouldn't be in the world of forms. A perfect game of baseball, because by definition, a game, the outcome is not clear. So you can't have a perfect game that's already determined and eternal. That can't happen. So there's plenty of things. Another thing is a leaf. Well, what's a perfect leaf? Well, what is would a perfect leaf include a pine needle as well as an oak leaf? So those aren't really appropriate for the world of forms. They're not really things that we'd find in the world of forms. Things we find in the world of forms are like mathematics and beauty and perhaps justice, um, and things of that nature, not specific things. So we don't have a model of the best haircut in the world of forms, the ideal haircut. That kind of thing doesn't exist. And then addressing the same sort of issue with recollection. Now, both of these, I've said before, both of these seem like the most absurd ideas anybody could have. And I just, by the way, I sent you all a graphic of ancient Athens and of I think Socrates jail. And when I did that, now YouTube, of course, the algorithm sends me a bunch of crap about Plato. And when I say crap, I'm not exaggerating. I couldn't believe there. I just had to tune into a couple of lectures on Plato, and I couldn't believe how ignorant they were. Uh, but they were young people, like some guy who had an English accent, but he was only about 30. And I thought, well, okay, fair enough. But man, don't put this stuff online. It was idiotic. But anyway, in the world of recollection, but to be fair, that's the way it looks the first time you look at it. You look at Plato and you go, what's this crap? I mean, even Wittgenstein thought it wasn't worth pursuing. He thought it was on the face of it, just superficial, which begs the question of how Plato's stuck around for 2,500 years and people still think he's one of the big guys. Anyway, the ridiculous world of forms. Yeah, is there a perfect haircut? No, that doesn't exist in the world of forms. And then the other thing is in the world of or the mode of recollection in learning something. Well, how can I recollect, for instance, all of your names? Is that something I could recollect from a former life? I don't think so. None of us were alive. You weren't alive either. So how could I know your name from a former life? So it's easy to make fun of the doctrine of recollection. What Plato has done is said, look, we have this mystery. This slave boy can do this. And I've tried to explain why I think that even if you say Socrates was leading him on through the whole thing, at one point in the evolution of critters on the planet, somebody figured it out. How did they figure it out? That's what Plato's question is. And the answer is we don't know. Nobody knows, including Plato. And so what does he do? He tells you a myth. Well, it could be. And so you're not going to find a perfectly symmetrical, consistent system out of Plato. If you want that kind of thing, you have to look at a religion. Religions posit something that is just definitely true, and that's you have to. And we're going to get to all this stuff, but Augustine and Anselm say you have to believe in order to understand. In other words, you believe what we're saying first, and then all the other crap that we're going to say is going to make sense to you. Well, this is just about the worst way to approach understanding the world as anything I can think of. And I'm going to offend a lot of people as we talk about religion, not because I hate religion, because I'm very fond of religions, but there are some claims that don't bear any weight as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, Saint Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, who we're going to study, is a guy who has the most systematic philosophy of any Western writer. Unfortunately, it's full of all kinds of fallacies which undercut the systematic stability. Now, Plato's just too smart to do that. He says, okay, here's a bunch of puzzles and here's some ideas. I don't know. That's kind of what Plato does. But the ideas are brilliant. They're not stupid or naive. They appear stupid or naive at first glance, but actually it's like I've quoted Churchill before. They're terrible ideas until you compare them with all the rest. So anyway, to answer or respond to Alan's thing about the specific perfect oak tree, no, that's just not what Plato's up to. And if it were, he wouldn't have lasted more than a week or two rather than 2,500 years. That's one thing I wanted to address. And it's too bad, Alan, I know he's not going to be here today, but I have to move along with this stuff anyway. We have to just keep plunging forward. There are many thinkers we're going to come across that have the same thing that I'm accusing Augustine of, which is that believe in order to understand. And I mentioned Bertrand Russell's interview with Lenin, and how Lenin was up to the same thing. I mean, and Russell was shocked. He said, he asked him something and Lenin just referred to the, scripture, Marx, and that was the end of it. So if you believe that, then everything falls into place. This is not well, in my view, it's not a good, well, it's not what philosophy is up to. Let's put it that way. Let's forget about my view. It's not what philosophy is up to. All right. I've got much more to say about that, but I'm not going to continue with it. Except insofar as we'll be addressing such things the entire semester. Another thing, well, what I said we were going to do here today is start on ethics. And so this class is going to be two classes kludged together, my ethics class and my metaphysics class. But they're not independent. They depend on one another. So if you, for instance, believe Jesus is the Redemptor, your ethics are going to change. If you believe, like Hobbes does, that everybody's always being selfish, then you're going to have a different ethics from what Jesus's ethics are. Although, interestingly enough, and this shows what a mess the field of ethics is, Hobbes and Jesus both quote the Golden Rule. But the metaphysics below that, what's supporting that, is entirely different. Jesus says you do this for your eternal soul, to obey God's will. And that's why you do it. Plus, you should love your brother. Hobbes says you do it for your own protection, that you do it out of selfish reasons. If you don't act that way, you're liable to be your power or your authority in society is liable to be reduced. So it's a selfish program or plan for your own advancement to follow the Golden Rule. Now, I would say those are very different rules, even though they both come out with the same words. And so ethics is a pretty big mess along those lines. Everybody tries to present their ethics as if they're the be all and end all. Everybody does. So I want to, first of all, what I'm going to start out with is the different varieties of ethics that we're going to see in the world. And the Greeks have something called virtue ethics, and other people do. Virtue ethics is how to live the best life. That's what Plato and Aristotle are concerned with. And actually, the Stoics, Cynics, I don't know about the Cynics, Stoics, Cynics, and Epicureans are also trying to answer the question how to live the best life. And by extension, how to set up a society so that everybody can live their best life. That's called virtue ethics. And all religions claim that to live the best life, you're going to follow their teaching. Clearly, this is the truth. And if you do anything else that doesn't correspond to the truth that we're going to teach you, you obviously can't be living your best life. It's just going against everything. Yeah. So all religions are going to be basically, religions claim that there are all these kinds of ethics put in one bunch. The other kinds of ethics I want to mention have to do with obligations. The religions aren't primarily usually concerned with your obligations to others. They're more concerned with your obligations to God. Of course, they will say that if you do what we teach, it will benefit all of mankind. Or if everybody did this, then all of mankind are going to be benefited. But they don't, we call that teleological ethics, just to use the word. Teleology is based on the word telos, which means purpose or end. It's the fourth of Aristotle's four causes. So telos is to achieve a particular end. You're going to do this, to hammer a nail properly, you don't use a banana, so the purpose that you're trying to achieve dictates what your actions are to try to accomplish that purpose. That's called teleological ethics. John Stuart Mill would fall under that heading. The greatest good for the greatest number. How do you accomplish that? It's a practical outcome that you wish to achieve. It's not based on rules from God. It's not based on your any kind of rules you get from the Boy Scouts or from the Army or from religion. Now, rule-based ethics are called deontological. Deontological ethics, and that would be the poster boy for that is Kant. So Mill is the epitome or most commonly cited teleological philosopher, and Kant is the most frequently cited deontological philosopher. Now, all religions are deontological. In other words, if you want to obey God, you will abide by these rules. These are the rules. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. Jesus doesn't talk about how to improve or decrease the income disparity. It's not like there wasn't any income disparity in Rome, but that's not what Jesus was up to. And in the case of Jesus, we call his ethics eschatological, which means to do with the end times, Judgment Day. What do you do so that on Judgment Day you can face your Maker and look him in the eye and not be ashamed of what you did? Those are called eschatological ethics, and they're deontological. Have you followed the rules? Have you been a good Christian? And so those are some categories of ethics. It's a huge mishmash because, for instance, Hobbes, for example, says, if you read the Leviathan, it's all about this thing about, and we're going to look at him in some depth. The Leviathan is about how people are all acting selfishly. And the only way to inhibit that or ameliorate that is to have a very strong monarch that controls everybody's wishes to do each other harm.
Tony, can you
Yeah.
break that word deontological down? how
Can I
it's
write
when
it down?
it's
I could spell it out.
or just break it down in terms of
Oh,
what those syllables
well,
mean.
D means from, and on means rule, I think. And then logical just means study of. I I think it's ons is the eventual Greek root. It's a Greek root. And then teleological is from, like I said, Aristotle. So telos and then logical.
Yeah, the deontological thing always confused me because of ontology.
I don't think it's from the same root,
Yeah,
oddly enough.
yeah.
Uh, but I can't be sure of that. We need Nietzsche in the room. He's a Greek philosopher, uh, a Greek philologist. Um, so, and then eschatological, do you need that? Es, okay, eschatology has to do with the end times. All right. So the thing that makes ethics so messy is just every system will claim that, oh, I was going to finish with Hobbes. Hobbes, that's the picture of mankind he gives you, that we're just a bunch of animals that are trying to dog eat dog world, basically. That's the world Hobbes presents to us. And he says the only way to cure this is through a strong monarch that'll whip your ass if you do anything against any of the other citizens. I'll talk about this in greater detail. But then at the end of the Leviathan, he talks about how this is all consistent with the Bible. Yeah. I mean, come on, Hobbes. What are you trying to pull here? It's not consistent with the Bible at all, in a variety of ways. The only consistency would maybe be that we're all sinners. Okay, we're all selfish, but that's really not this. They're not saying the same thing there. The Bible and Hobbes are not saying the same thing about sin. So we will be covering all of these things in more detail as we move along. But I just wanted to set the general framework of varieties of, like, another example would be of a virtue philosophy would be follow your bliss, like Joseph Campbell or Oprah. If you want to live your best life, follow your bliss. Well, what if my bliss is raping little children? Is that the bliss I'm supposed to follow? And this brings us back to Socrates and Epicurus, who we'll talk briefly about. He thinks that the basis of all morality, as does Ayn Rand, by the way. Oh my God, she is so dumb. I read. Did any of you guys get my critique of the virtue of selfishness a while back on the Meredith list? Well, I read it. I don't know why. I'd read it many years ago, but I thought, okay, I'll go back to it again now. Maybe I can appreciate the arguments better now that I have a little education. Maybe I didn't understand them properly. But quite the reverse happened. I couldn't believe how stupid the arguments were. Quite apart from any repugnance I have for her teachings, the arguments were so self-evidently ignorant and poorly framed. I was just appalled. But anyway, she also believes, supposedly, I could give you the quote, that all ethics is basically based on what makes you happy or pleasure. A whole bunch of people are going to say this, including Bentham and Mill and Nietzsche and Epicurus and Ayn Rand, just to name a few. They're all going to say, because they all want to be hard-headed empiricists. So how do you know something is good? Well, it feels good. It makes you happy, so it must be good. That's basically Epicurus and all these other guys too. I'm not kidding. It's that simple. Or maybe I'm the simple one. I don't know, but I think all their arguments can be reduced to, this makes me feel good, so it's good. And in fact, even Hemingway said, what's good is what you feel good afterwards. That's a quote from Hemingway. So I don't know. I'm not really willing to do that. It might make me feel very good to wring Donald Trump's neck, and I think he's so old and fat that I could probably accomplish it as old as I am. However, I'm not certain that's the good. I'm not certain that's the good. That seems open to question to me. Anyway, so let's get back to the Greeks. First of all, let's talk about the Greek virtues, which are temperance, courage, wisdom, or prudence, and justice. Those are the four cardinal virtues. Sometimes we also list piety and beauty. Those are, in other words, this isn't a doctrine laid down by some authority in Greece. This is kind of a general cultural thing. Those are the virtues that Christians call the cardinal virtues. In other words, they're not based on teachings of the Bible. They are, or any religion, they are supposedly things that will lead to a virtuous life. And again, I said before, virtue in Greece doesn't mean you're nice and empathetic and do good for the poor. It means that you're living a full life. You have those qualities. That's what makes up a full life, is having the qualities I just mentioned: courage, prudence or wisdom, justice, and temperance. Those are the virtues. And I think they're good virtues. I don't have an argument with that. Plato also has a doctrine called the unity of the virtues. Actually, I don't know if he ever calls it that, but the tradition calls it the unity of the virtues, meaning that you can't have any one of the virtues without having all of them. So an example I often use is Bill Maher got fired from, what is up with that guy? Bill Maher got fired from, what was he on? He was on some network, and he said this. He said, you can accuse the 9/11 terrorists of a lot of things, but you can't accuse them of being cowards, right? And that really pissed a lot of people off. Well, why did it piss them off? Because we don't like to associate bravery or courage with a cause that is not just. So in other words, you can't really be courageous in service of a cause that is an unjust cause. So to be courageous, you also have to be just. And well, I think the same thing applies in the opposite direction. You can't be just unless you're courageous enough to say what you believe and say the right thing or do the right thing when it's necessary to do the right thing. Then you're not just, you're a coward. All right, so then temperance, I think that's kind of an obvious virtue, to not just fly off the handle and kill people because you're mad or whatever you're doing. You can't be just if you're intemperate, and you can't be courageous if you're intemperate, I think they would say. And then Aristotle's going to try to define this by, I find myself using that phrase, Aristotle's going to try to. Some people would say he succeeded. He's going to try to define, say, temperance as a mean, or courage as a mean between two extremes. And so if you're just a coward, and I mean, in other words, if you're scared to do everything, you're scared to go out the door, you're scared to go to a party, if everything scares you, that's just too far. But on the other hand, if nothing scares you, like jumping off a cliff, like you see in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, if nothing scares you, you're an idiot too. So those are two extremes, and true courage is someplace in between those things. That's what Aristotle tries to do. I don't want to get off the track here, but that would be temperance applied to courage, if that makes sense. That you can't be intemperate and still be courageous. Yeah, Barry.
Well, okay, so what about someone who is in a war situation and exhibits an act of courage in that situation by, rushing toward the enemy to annihilate him? How is that a temperate? How could that be temperate to do that?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, I just finished watching literally over 100 hours of documentaries on the war in the Pacific, and it is just mind-bending the stuff these guys did and how horrible the situations they went through were. And there's a lot of stories like that. Guys doing something they know is going to result in their death. There's no question about it. But the Japanese did it too. That's what a kamikaze is. And they didn't just do kamikaze attacks with planes, they also did them with people, where they all knew they would get killed, but it was like banzai, and they were going to go attack a superior force, and they knew they would die. Every one of them would die. And the same thing is true of the Spartans at the Battle of Marathon. So Barry, that's a long way of saying I don't have an answer for I don't have an answer for you, but I think we know. You know, is Evel Knievel courageous? Is that the same thing as being courageous or brave? I don't know. It's a you know, he's making reckless choices in the interest of what? Of being famous or getting rich or something? Yeah. Is that why he's doing it? Then I would think that it wouldn't quite match up to what we'd want to think of as courage.
It seems like when you say that you have to have all of those qualities in order to have any one of them, you have to have all of them. That begs the question of forces you to go and define those qualities more carefully, so that there's a way to show that they can all be possessed simultaneously.
Right, and that's what Aristotle did with the golden mean. You know, the medium between the two. It says on the. By the way, I didn't mention this on the Temple of the Oracle at Delphi. It says nothing in excess, and this is often translated as moderation in all things. That's on the temple. It's not something Plato said, but this is something Aristotle tried to define. And moderation in all things, I always like to say moderation in all things, including moderation. But Aristotle tried to define just what you're talking about, Barry, by saying it's a mean between two extremes. But I think we can find exceptions to that rule, where, I mean, like the ones you mentioned, or the ones in fact, Barry Goldwater, what did he say? He said it was something. It's probably his most famous quote. It was something about moderation in the service of freedom is no virtue.
Extremism.
And extremism, yeah, that's Barry Goldwater, and he's kind of saying the opposite of what Aristotle's saying. Is that there's a time for extremism. Anyway, so no, Barry, I don't have an answer for you. I don't have a good answer for you. I'm just, but this is the teaching of Plato, that you need to have all the virtues to have any of them, and it kind of makes a bit of sense. And then it's interesting that Plato sometimes lists beauty as a virtue, and I don't know what to make of that. He doesn't explain it when he just says these are the virtues. And beauty. The only way I can associate that with the rest of Platonism is by what we were talking about with Laura last time, which is the beauty of mathematics, the purity and beauty of something that's done to a perfect and elegant style, in a perfect and elegant manner. That, I think, is what he means by beauty. I don't think he means the foxiest girl is there. However, that's an interesting thing, that when you see somebody, let's just say George Clooney, wouldn't you think it was really horrible if you found out that he was a child abuser or something like that? Because the fact that he's handsome and so dashing and charismatic, it would be extra horrible if you see Charles Bukowski being a reprobate, that's one thing, but George Clooney would be that much more shocking. So I think the Greeks, like us, we expect our heroes to be at least somewhat good looking, although I'm not sure that applies to Monk. I'm trying to think or Columbo. I'm not sure. Anyway, it's curious to me that he includes it, but it isn't inconsistent with Plato saying that the ultimate form is the form of the good, and Keith said, truth is beauty, beauty, truth. That's all you know on this earth and all you need to know. That's into Ode to a Grecian Urn. I paraphrase. I'm not sure that's word for word what he said. Very close, though. So that's kind of a Platonic notion, I think. Now, another aspect of Plato's ethics is the idea that it's a matter of knowledge, and Plato never says this, but to know the good is to do the good. In other words, I kind of am fond of this. If you do something that you know, or you say later, I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway, I think I'm justified in saying I don't believe you knew it was wrong, or else you wouldn't have done it, because the fact that you did it is evidence that you thought it was the right thing to do, and you can't undo that. Again, I associated this with existentialism, but anyway, it is definitely true that Socrates thinks that all errors in virtue are intellectual errors. In other words, you've made a misjudgment. You haven't understood what you should have understood in order to do that. However, Socrates often will refer to a divine, like at the end of the Meno, it's such a train wreck. You don't know what's going on there, but he refers to divine inspiration for leaders and something he calls right opinion or right judgment. What that is for Plato is doing the right thing, but not really fully understanding what it was. In other words, not being able to, like, with perfect logic, defend it, and yet it's the right thing. It's very fuzzy what Plato thinks about that, but he acknowledges the possibility that you could be doing the right thing without being able to find a perfect justification for it. And we're going to find this again in Kant and Mill, because both those guys are going to say that in different ways. They're going to say that ultimately, I can't tell you it's the right thing to do to follow my morality. There's no way of justifying it. If you don't have any sense that you want to do the right thing, in other words, you will not care if you're doing the right thing for the greatest number of people. You won't care about it. And I can't tell you how to care about it. If you don't, you're kind of off the playing field. I don't know how to address you. Mill admits that. and for Kant, for his part, he says that the way he phrases it is, if you're going to have an ethical system, it should be comprised of the categorical imperative, or it should satisfy the categorical imperative. He says, if you're going to have one. He doesn't say that it's embedded in the universe like Plato wants to say. He doesn't say it's for the betterment of all mankind, as Mill would say. He would say it's just logically inconsistent to violate the categorical imperative and at the same time claim you're being moral. That's a sine qua non for any ethical system. But he says that's if you're going to have an ethical system. And the only way he can justify it is by saying you must act as if it mattered, as if there was such a thing as justice. He doesn't say there is. He says, if you're going to be moral and follow the categorical imperative, you must act as if it matters, or there is some truth to it. I'm always kind of interested in philosophers that are willing to admit the limitations of what they can say, and that's one of the reasons why I am fond of Plato, because he's quite willing to do. And Hume, and Plato, and Wittgenstein are all people who will draw a line and say, beyond this, I can't really tell you. I admire that. For some reason, it's a humility that I respect, rather than, it's the opposite of what a religion does. All religions say, well, this is it, this is the truth, and if you're going to walk the right path, you have to follow this. Okay, there's not a lot more to say, I don't think, about Platonic ethics, even though, well, there's the three parts of the soul. We've already been through this. The three parts of the soul: harmony and therefore happiness, or eudaimonia, is achieved through a balance of the three parts of the soul. So none of them is disproportionately affecting your decisions. Ultimately, however, they have to all respond to rationality. But if you don't have passion, you won't be rational. That would be another way of saying what Kant says and Mill says. Yes, this is the rational thing to do, but if you don't have the passion to do the rational thing, it doesn't matter what the rational thing to do is. And we'll get back to that with Hume and Kant and Mill. And then if you're not alive, so you're not following your appetites and eating, it doesn't matter what your morals are either. So all those things play a role in having you be a balanced person, or a happy person, and have a happy life. All right. Any questions about that stuff? Any of that stuff? It may be disappointing to you that Plato doesn't give us a hard and fast rule, but I don't find it disappointing. I find he examines all the paths that you can take and goes, I can't really lay down the law here. Sometimes it seems like he's doing that, but then there's always hedging his bet someplace.
When you say that in order to be, that passion and rationality must both be present at the same time, that's a different definition or usage of passion from what we commonly would think of, because passion, emotion. It seems like you're acting on emotion, not rational. I mean, passion is almost inherently non-rational in some usages.
Well, okay, that is a more common way to do it, and that would be how Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas deal with that. But Plato would say you have to have passion just to want to do the right thing, and so there's a passion behind being just and being temperate. That's how Plato would frame the problem. And in the end, if you haven't done the right thing, it's because you didn't have the passion to figure out what the right thing was. Does that make sense? Just a different way to frame the problem. As opposed to, yeah, what you're saying is typical of Aristotle and Aquinas. Yeah, you could figure out the right thing, but what if you don't have the willpower to do the right thing? And Aristotle, as I think I mentioned, calls this incontinence, of all things. That's the word. He didn't write in English, but essentially the word is incontinence. You can't control yourself, and so that's a deficit for sure for Aristotle. But he recognizes it as something that humans do, whereas Socrates says, no, you're not incompetent. You didn't understand what you're doing. And who was it? I think it was Meredith that mentioned her clients that have something wrong with their minds. And so they don't, and this is a legally recognized kind of thing. If you're incompetent to stand trial, it means you really don't know the difference between right and wrong. And I don't think Socrates is addressing himself to that. And I don't think Aristotle is addressing himself to that. He's assuming you're a solid citizen, a normal person. You're not psychotic. You're not a psychopath, and you want to do the right thing. And Socrates says if you don't do the right thing, it means you didn't have the will, and so you didn't understand it. You made a mistake. And Aristotle and Aquinas don't say that. They say, yeah, well, we're sinners. I mean, if you're Aquinas, you would say, well, we're all sinners. None of us are perfect. Okay. Any more stuff on ethics, on the Platonic ethics? It's not that all that helpful. Although, like I say, I am fond of the idea that if I do something wrong, it's because I didn't understand what the right thing was. I'm fond of that idea. That's the best I could say about it. Ethics is really Wittgenstein, even a guy like Wittgenstein, who's very hard-headed, I mean, very analytic. He says ethics and aesthetics are one and the same. And in other words, just a matter of taste. I don't go along with that. I'm more of a Platonist that thinks we know what the right thing is somehow. But that's what Wittgenstein says. So no less a thinker than Wittgenstein subscribes to that position. I think he's wrong, but we will probably not get to that. But those are the Platonic ethics. So
one last question, Tony.
yeah.
Back to Socrates' demon, as you described it, the voice in his head. When you first described that, it sounded to me like a conscience. Similar idea of having a conscience, that there's this voice inside you that, you know, kind of guides your behavior. So I'm wondering if that aspect of Socrates' mind has anything to do with this question about, you know, ethics, because, you know, isn't a conscience kind of a way of saying, well, you know, I acted a certain way, but I have a bad feeling about it. And maybe I didn't really fully understand it, or, you know, maybe I shouldn't have done it. I mean, that seems like that gets to ethical issues.
Well, now the demon, by the way, is his word for it, not mine.
Right.
And I don't think I can't think of him ever spending a lot of time actually discussing this in detail. But what he says it specifically on before his speech in the Apology, or concerning his speech in the Apology, that his demon didn't tell him not to do it, so he thinks it's okay. So that I would say, if I could try to kludge this together with the rest of Platonic thought, I would say that this falls under the heading of right opinion. In other words, Socrates may be not able to say, like somebody in this class raised the issue of whether Socrates intended to be, it's like death by cop. Did he intend to be convicted? Did he intend to be executed by the state to set an example? I think that's unlikely. I think what he intended to do was not back down. And his demon didn't tell him to back down, didn't tell him he was doing the wrong thing. And that's the best he could do. You know, maybe an argument could be made against that. Maybe like you might be able to come up with a utilitarian argument about how Socrates should have decided that his continuing teaching in Athens, as opposed to his death, would have provided a greater benefit to the citizenry of Athens than his death. You could come up with an argument in favor of that. He doesn't bother to do that. He doesn't say, his argument is a bit of a Kantian argument, but it's a little bit, in other words, he says, look, I obeyed the laws of Athens my whole life, and they have treated me well. And I'm obliged to them for the happy life I've led and the absence of, I don't know, crime or some kind of attack from other sources. I've relied on them, and so it would be untoward of me now to do something opposed to the laws, since I've benefited so much from them. That's his kind of a way of justifying it. But that's when Credo, after the trial, when Credo comes and offers him an escape, that's what he says. I don't know. It's a good question, Barry. I'm just going to say it falls under the heading of right opinion. I don't know how it could be justified exactly, or you could think of arguments on both sides. Any other things?
Yeah, Tony,
Yeah.
is there a modern thinker or thinkers who you think best develop these Platonic notions of ethics? That's where's all this gone since Plato to the current?
Well, it's an obvious question. You want to think that there's been some progress, but I don't think it's the case. If you look at Plato, you're going to be doing as well as any modern thinker can do. In the 20th century, just to approach it from that angle, we have a variety of a mix of rather disappointing ethical approaches. One is deconstructionism, and deconstructionism is just saying, well, what's right is whatever anyone who is powerful says is right. Essentially, it's kind of a Marxist thing that our values are influenced by corporate interests, and that's what makes us think the way we do. That's one approach, which Plato has already covered. That the interest of the powerful, that's what Thrasymachus and Callicles are going to argue, and the Gorgias and the Republic. They're going to say it's the interest of the powerful, and that's how it works. And to say otherwise is to be naive. That's one school of thought. Another school of thought is the approach of the analytic philosophers, who try to figure out how they approach it. They say, how are ethical terms used? How are they used? Let's figure out how they're used, and that will tell us what they really mean, not what we think they mean. Like the Platonic idea is to discuss them until you figure out what they really mean. But the analytic philosophers, the linguistic analysts, they just say, well, see how they function in everyday conversation. That's also just not a very satisfying. Neither of those things are very satisfying to me. Although, they both have points that are worth evaluating. But I'd like to tell you, Bill, that there's an answer, and there isn't one, and you just have to kind of pick something that feels right to you. And what I would say is that implies you know what's right, which brings us back to Meno's paradox. How do you know it's right? You have to know it's right to pick one that's right. And Plato would just say, you recall the good. So just about, all paths lead back to Plato, I'm afraid. It took me even longer to discover that than you just keep reading all the philosophers and you go, wait a minute, Plato already covered this. And you keep doing that. And that's why Alfred North Whitehead said that Western philosophy is best considered as a long footnote to Plato. It's not inaccurate to say that. At least that's my view. So you're just getting my view, but it's not like I haven't spent a lot of time with this stuff. I've been looking at it since I was like 17. And like I say, you could do this while you're sailing or riding your bike or something. It's not like you have to be looking at the book to be studying philosophy. You think it over. Does that make sense? Did that teaching or that doctrine make sense?
Tony,
I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you, Bill.
How do the existentialists? What is the existential approach to these ethical questions?
It depends on the existentialist. Sartre became a Marxist. Heidegger was a Nazi, an unrepentant Nazi, but he says that the idea was to live authentically. And I think that's the closest I could come to a broad definition of what Kierkegaard and Sartre and Nietzsche and Heidegger and others. Those are guys that we think of as the existentialists, and in literature, Camus. And that is to live authentically. The other thing, the little slogan of existentialism is existence precedes essence. And that means that there isn't any good that's out there that's already predetermined that you need to comport yourself according to. You make up the good in your life by your actions. And that's, again, what Hemingway says, which is, you know what's good if it makes you feel good afterwards, which isn't much help. None of this is much help. But the existentialists, I think, will agree with Socrates that your actions determine what you are, or evidence of what you believe, not what you say. That's also a cliche, you know, believe what I do and not what I say, or vice versa. But the existentialists, by the nature of existentialism, they can't claim that they know the good, or they can't claim they know the right thing. Nietzsche has a set of values that are, you know, represented by the Übermensch, the will to power, and we'll be getting to that. And it's easy to hate Nietzsche, that's for sure. It's easy to think that he's just a proto-Nazi and said all the most horrible things you can say. However, there's another way to look at it, and that is that these harsh judgments about weakness should be directed only towards yourself. And I think that's what Nietzsche does. That's how I read him anyway, that you should be hardest on yourself. And when he disparages weakness of any kind, he's talking to himself. He himself was a physically weak person. In other words, a sickly person. I see Doug's got something up here. Did you, you got a couple of websites. What are those for, Doug?
There are a couple of YouTubes about various, there's one is about existentialism. And the other one is Oxford philosophy.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, they're just, they're amusing more than anything else.
I came into philosophy through the door of the existentialists. I wouldn't be sitting here right now talking about philosophy if it wasn't for them. And they, the existentialists and like guys like Hegel inspired me to follow this route as if it was going to lead someplace. And where it led was eventually back to Plato. And so my personal feeling about my own development is that those guys have become part of my thinking, and they are, I don't even discuss them anymore, because Elizabeth Anscombe, who's a 20th century interpreter of Wittgenstein, one of the big ones, she says the existentialists are wet behind the ears. And I think she says that because, to quote another great sage, Evel Knievel, you should have made your peace with God by the time you're 30. And that's kind of how I look at the existentialists. I really needed to study those guys because they throw cold water on the big thinkers of the past. On the other hand, you got to get over that, because that's where the meat and potatoes are. Stephen Erickson from Pomona said, you cannot be a full human being unless you've been a romantic. But if you remain a romantic through your entire life, you also can't be a full human being. So I kind of look at the stage of my life when I was enamored of the existentialist as a romantic stage, where I was, you know, Sturm und Drang, man against the world, that kind of passionate thing. And the next step, though, is the next steps are the ones where you're actually not just yelling, but you're trying to figure things out. It's all well and good to yell like Nietzsche did. I compare Nietzsche to a guy who walks in, the kind of guy. Have you ever known somebody that would walk into a bar and immediately assess who could kick his ass? Just the kind of guy that's always looking for, not necessarily wants to get into a fight, but he wants to know where the fight's coming from. That's how he assesses bars. Well, Nietzsche's like that when he enters the intellectual world. Who's the biggest guy here? Who's the biggest, toughest guy? Well, it's the Christian church. So that's who I'm going to go after. I don't know if that's fair to Nietzsche or the Christian church, but that's kind of how I look at him. He was itching for a fight. And I think he did a good job of creating one. The new atheism. I see you've mentioned that, Doug. Doug?
Yeah, I saw the note about Sam Harris, and I was wondering if that's the Sam Harris that Deb was meaning.
Somebody had a note about Sam Harris. Somebody's got a long quote here from Plato. Oh, look at this. I haven't had this open, I'm afraid. Oh, I see. That's Zoom. Amazing Laurel. Amazing. What's amazing? God, I haven't been following this.
Well, I'm not seeing that.
Deborah was asking about the modern philosopher Sam Harris. Then Doug said the new atheism.
Yeah,
question mark.
I like Sam Harris. I haven't. He's one of these guys that pops up on YouTube a lot, and I haven't been watching him. The new atheists are Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens. Those are usually the three guys that get mentioned most often with the new atheism. I don't think there's a whole lot new there. They mainly what they do is rail against irrational belief, and also in the case of Hitchens, the crimes of religion. This is not really new territory. And when we get to Christianity, the first guy I start with in Christianity is Tertullian, who says, of course it's irrational. Of course it doesn't make any sense. That's why you need faith. Anybody who tries to shore up their faith using rationality is using an inadequate tool. This is beyond any human rationality. You're just being idiots if you think you can somehow support faith with human reason. That's ridiculous. He's pretty funny. He's also a misogynist of the first degree. So I'll be quoting him, not because I approve of his misogyny, but because he's a good representative of the misogyny in Christianity from the get-go. But yes, I'm not sure. I love those guys, all three of them, Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens. And also Neil deGrasse Tyson has done a lot of kind of anti-Christian stuff or anti-religious stuff, just calling them out for irrational beliefs. I don't think this is a particularly new conversation. They're just really articulate guys, all three of them.
Tony, it's Deborah. The reason I brought up Sam Harris is I just skimmed one of his books that I found in the house, and I think what I got from him was that he's kind of saying that, like Plato, that we just know what's right, where there is a morality in human nature. But his whole thing, I thought, was that he was trying to prove it as a neuroscientist, that he was trying to prove that you can prove a morality using science. Now, I'm not enough of a scientist, and Laurel isn't here, but I think that was one of his ideas, wasn't it? That this stuff can be.
There have been many attempts through the years, starting with Epicurus, to prove morality through science in various ways, empiricism. I don't think Harris is any more successful than the rest of them. Just for example, you could argue that on the basis of utilitarianism, you could argue that there's an inbuilt instinct for us to create a world where everybody is happy. And that is an instinct we should pay attention to, and then we should rationally figure out what will make everybody happy. I think that's a fool's errand, but trying to figure out what will make people happy. Usually, we'll get to this. Utilitarianism is applied upside down. What will make the most people unhappy? That's usually what we worry about. Like, what will cause the most disease? What will cause war? Because you can't tell what will make people happy. But anyway, what I was going to say is Augustine could just say, if every human being was happy, it would be an illustration of how godless they are. Because everything they want is evil. What human beings desire is not good. It's evil. And so therefore, that's one of the problems with trying to define it through science or empirical investigations.
Got it.
Philby argued, I shouldn't talk about him behind his back, but I'll be glad to do so anyway. Philby and I got into an argument.
It's wrong.
I know it's wrong. Philby and I got into an argument about vaccines, and he was just, I can't recreate the whole, I love to argue with Philby, but I can't recreate the whole conversation. It would be too tedious. But one thing he wanted to say was, he actually made this point, I went, Philby, that, vaccines, what they do is they offset evolution so that weaker genes get reproduced, and they shouldn't get reproduced. It just weakens the gene pool. He made that eugenics kind of argument. And I said, Philby, on that argument, the Europeans that caused millions of deaths of Native Americans because they brought a disease there were doing them a favor, because they were clearing out all the weak genes in the Native American genome and just leaving the strong people. You want to go with that argument? He kept silent about it. He didn't have a response to that. The louder somebody says a solution, like Harris or Hitchens, I would love to argue with those guys. Hitchens had an argument with Tony Blair. I don't know if you ever saw this, but Hitchens was attacking Christianity and Tony Blair was defending it. And Hitchens was vicious and Tony Blair was limp. He was just, Tony, no. Stick to politics. I would have said, Christopher, you're being too nice to Christianity. And I would have listed a bunch of other things that Christians did. But the problem is that if you're going to say that human beings can be the judge of whether religion is achieving God's will in the world, you have to say that you understand what God's will is. And so if I'm a religious person, I just say, well, I don't care what Christopher Hitchens thinks about what damage has been done by, that's not what we're up to here, satisfying Christopher Hitchens' idea of justice. I would have started with that. But I would also said, but if we use his metric for what is good, you also have to count all the moments where somebody out of Christian empathy and belief helped another person. I don't think you can make a record of all those things. I don't think there'd be any way of, there's plenty of ways to describe, like the Crusades or things like that, some kind of purge, some kind of the Inquisition. All these crimes are very well documented. But how many people have documented a pastor going over to a friend's house who's ailing and praying with him? Those aren't documented. Now, maybe the prayer didn't do any good, but the fact that he went and visited this guy, I'd have to say, was something we have to count. So how are you going to add all that stuff up? Anyway, there isn't any way to do that. And so I'm very skeptical of any way of empirically verifying, like Harris is trying to do, getting back to that. empirically verifying any values or religions. That's why Plato was too smart to do it. Hume doesn't do it. He just says you can't do it. You know what Hume says is people do this. In other words, people do make ethical judgments. So what are they about? Well, let's just look and see what they do. That's it. And he comes up with the phrase common sentiment. It is the common view that this is inappropriate or bad behavior. And Hume's quite willing to acknowledge that's not a very good justification. It's just the best I could do. Those things make me laugh. Gee, we're after 11 now. I mean, I'm happy to continue this, of course, but any other if you want to
Tony,
talk about
one thought in talking about science-based ethics and so forth, and it's not to say that I can prove anything, but a way to look at that that's consistent with science is to say we human beings are very social animals, and you look at behaviors of social and non-social animals, they're different, and we associate in our families, we associate in our communities, we associate in our societies, and that those ethics really are sort of inherent to the way we operate as an animal. I mean, we do have the psychopaths in our government, but and they probably don't have those particular associations in there. But to say, well, finding our ethics is really a matter of finding out who we really are.
I'm going to use that exact argument against Hobbes, by the way, because Hobbes' portrayal of human beings is he thinks he's an empiricist. These guys that come across as we're going to be hard-headed here. We're going to just look at the facts and not engage in all that stupid philosophical meandering nonsense in the clouds. We're going to look at the facts. That doesn't usually pan out very well because it turns out their facts are pretty subjective. And that's true of Ayn Rand. It's true of Hobbes. It's true of, I'm afraid it's true of Marx. It's also true of Epicurus and Lucretius, I think. So it's not so easy to do that with impunity. You're gonna make some assumptions that can't be demonstrated is what you're gonna do. But yeah, Hobbes just ignores that, Gerald, to your point. He just ignores the fact that we have bonds, and the bonds are contribute to our survival as a species. And those bonds are solidified or strengthened by common decency. And so you could say the common decency is something that allowed for the Hobbesian kind of idea of survival of the fittest. We're more fit because we're congenial to one another. It's a kind of upside down social Darwinism. But I'd be willing to argue that. I don't think that's a stupid point. I think that's a good point. We're not the only ones. Ants and bees are also social animals that sacrifice themselves for the good of the group. And rats. It's interesting.
And porpoises
do porpoises do that?
I don't know.
Well?
I don't know about. Well, they've been known to just go find people and help them in a problem, and that there clearly is not only associated behaviors for hunting and so forth, but protection of each other and protection of animals that are not even porpoises.
To be fair to Hobbes, he didn't know any of this stuff, but I'm not going to let him off the hook for that excuse, because he claimed he was basing it on facts, on hard observations, unsentimental observations. That's a big thing with Ayn Rand, is how she's not being sentimental. Oh my God, what an idiot she is. I shouldn't say that because it makes it sound like I just have an emotional reaction to her. But my emotional reaction is to the lack of care she puts into her arguments, more than the fact that I don't think that laissez-faire capitalism it's not that. I'm not making a value judgment about her conclusions. It's her methodology that I find repugnant. I'll tell you what, we've gone an hour and 15. Maybe we've gone long enough today. What we're going to do next is I think we've gotten to as much as we're going to do about Plato. So next time, what I'm going to do is try to, as if we haven't spent enough time on him, I'm going to try to summarize the whole thing and the points, and then the bullet points, and then suggest, let's say, alternatives to Plato. Not so much criticisms, but ways in which maybe he can't account for things that he thinks he can account for, or things like that. But bear in mind, he doesn't claim to know things. He now, you might not think that's an excuse, but he kind of explicitly in his program writes dialogues and not expository position papers. He doesn't do that, which is just, I can't get over how brilliant that was and how tempting it is to just tell people what you think. But, well, he did in a way. All right. Closing thoughts from anyone?
Just to say, sorry, I had to step out for a minute to go off and be a Quaker for a few minutes about something.
Despicable.
I know. Questions of morality. So, but
well,
we'll see you next time.
What's that?
We'll see you next time.
Oh, see you next time. Yeah, maybe we'll hear about the Quaker meeting. All right, guys. So next time, finishing up on Plato, and we'll move on to Aristotle after that.
Thank you.
Cool,
All right.
Thanks, Tony.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah. Good luck on your jury.
Oh,
duties.
yeah. Right. If you weren't here, I have a jury summons. I'll find out tonight where I have to go. If I have to go, that means Thursday I won't be here. And I'll try to email you and let you know that.
Tell them you're a philosophy professor and they won't want you at all.
I already talked to McAtee about this. I said, will that be a good excuse? And he said, definitely. They don't want any and a musician. Tell them you're a musician and a philosophy professor, and they'll get rid of you very quickly.
No,
Hey,
they don't want Quakers. I refuse to take an oath.
Oh.
And then the judge has to go off and figure out what the alter is. I know there's a procedure for Quakers, but I can't remember what it is. He sends someone to go look it up, and meanwhile, all the lawyers look at me with little beady lawyer eyes.
Hey, be careful about our beady eyes.
Watch
Yeah.
Read the room.
Like there must be something that is this a good thing for our case or a bad thing?
Yeah.
They're trying to squint at me and figure out whether it's good or bad, and then sooner or later get dismissed. Every time.
Being a
In
lawyer,
Arizona, it's if you're 75 or over, you don't have to serve.
Oh, I'm 78. How do I get a jury? Can I tell them that? Is that true everywhere? Or where is that true?
No, in
True in
Arizona.
Mass.
Where are you, Catherine?
Arizona.
Okay. I wonder if it's true.
Yeah, I just got a jury summons.
It's true in Massachusetts.
I like being on a jury, but yeah, it would interfere with the class if you had to do that.
Nothing better than to stand in judgment of your fellow human beings.
yeah.
What could be more pleasurable than that? It's one of the most venerated parts of sailing. Also. Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to look that up. Maybe I don't have to be there.
I know. I didn't know how I was going to get out of it, but there it was.
Well, all right then. Okay, well, we'll see you next Thursday, barring my absence because of my citizenry responsibilities. So see you then.
We'll see.